Hey everyone! Today we'll be going over how to set up and use a stacking worm bin. Vermicomposting, or the use of worms to make worm castings as a fertilizer, is one of the easiest ways to produce an organic fertilizer. And out of all the ways you can do this, a stacking worm bin is one of the most accessible, as it's small, cheap, self-contained, inconspicuous, and extremely easy to manage. So this is the Essential Living Composter, which is the cheapest one I was able to find on Amazon. And for the most part, all of these function similarly, with the more expensive ones being larger or with more stacking tiers, which we'll explain why in a little bit. But first, to set one of these up, I'm installing the legs to the bottom catch tray. And this tray is just used to remove any excess moisture that might build up in the worm bins, hence the spigot on the bottom. The next tray is where the worms will start out. And to start, this bin came with a block of coco coir and some shredded paper to use as its base, which I'm expanding with water before adding it in. Shredded paper, shredded corrugated cardboard, coco coir, peat moss, and finished compost all work great as a bedding for the worms. It'll need to always stay damp but not wet for the worms to be happy. Now I'm adding in 500 worms. And the rule of thumb seems to be up to a pound of worm for each square feet of space. This worm bin is around 15 inches by 15 inches, which is a little larger than a square foot, so it can support at least a pound of worms, which conveniently is about 1,000 worms. But I wanted to start smaller to get used to the worm bin, hence the half pound of worms. To prevent the worms embedding from falling through the holes at the bottom of the tray, I lined it with some weed block that I had lying around, and it did a great job in holding everything together. After dropping in the worms, I gave them a day to acclimate to the new environment. Then I gave them some food to start off. Worms can eat just about any fruit or vegetable, except for the things that are too acidic. And the key thing to note is that worms can't bite through things. So the scraps either need to already be soft, or they'll need it decomposed a little bit to the point where they're soft enough for the worms to suck up. This means that to speed the vermicomposting process, you can chop up solid organic waste to increase the exposed surface area so that it decomposes just a little faster. And if you really want, you can always blend up the organic waste so that the worms can have access to it right away. Although, honestly, this is way too much work for me to recommend doing, and I never went so far to do it myself. But yeah, worms can eat about a fourth to half their body weight each day. So depending on how many worms you have, you should follow this accordingly, trying not to overload the amount of food provided, since anything the worms don't finish in a few days will continue to rot and attract bugs and pests. This is also why each time I feed worms, I'll either bury it or add some coco coir on top of it. And I'll place a newspaper on top of everything as a worm blanket that can keep the pests out, and it also encourages the worms to stay near the top of the worm bin to feed on any new organic matter I add in. This does mean that I need to ensure the newspaper is always a little damp so the worms are comfortable touching it. But as long as the bedding is damp, this happens pretty much on its own. Plus, the newspaper will let me know the condition of the bedding, since if it does dry out, it probably means that the bedding is too dry, and if it's soaking wet, it probably means that the bedding is too wet. There's supposed to be air holes in every worm bin setup, since the worms need air to survive. And with this stacking tray, there's a little gap between where the trays meet as well as the lid. I'm not a big fan of this, since I found it just large enough for small bugs like fruit flies to get into the tray. But once I started burying the scraps, it helped a lot in preventing them. A few months later, once the bottom layer was full and the bedding has this dark color to it, it means that it's about ready to harvest, so I'm just adding in a fresh layer of coco coir on top of the holes of the top tray, which will allow the bottom layer worms to migrate to the top layer. And then to entice the worms to move up, I'm adding a layer of food before covering it all up with some more new bedding. Give it some time, and once the worms move up, you can now harvest the bottom tray. And then once it's empty, you can reuse it as the new top tray once this tray gets full. And that's it.